Good evening and salam alaikum, and hopefully everybody will join in a few minutes. I wanted really today to spend some time on discussing Palestine. It's something colonial. Again, this is in reference to the book Palestine. It's something colonial, and the title is very important because the title "It's Something Colonial" comes from the statement of Theodore Herzl when writing to Cecil Rhodes about why should the Zionist project be adopted by the British and support and help the establishment of a Jewish state. So he says, why do I turn to you in such a matter? He says, because it's something colonial. And in essence, we have to also speak of how history tends to be introduced with the Nakba being the beginning or the starting point. So it says many books, articles, and materials relating to Palestine tend to begin the Palestinian dispossession and expulsion with the period immediately before and after the 1948 Nakba catastrophe. But more accurate for all the purposes, it was the British occupation and mandate that made the Zionist colonization possible and eventually successful. So when you speak about settler colonialism in particular, it engages in two things, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes separately, sometimes in succession. Settler colonialism engages in genocide and engages in transfer. Genocide of the indigenous population takes place, and then the transfer of the remaining, sometimes transfer outside the historical indigenous population lands, and sometimes within the territories. If we think of the United States, the genocide of the indigenous population, and followed by the transfer of the indigenous population to what we call the reservations, which in reality are refugee camps that the indigenous populations have been reduced to. So in a similar way, if we think of Palestine, it is a settler colonialism, and Zionism began by systematic transfer, expulsion, ethnic cleansing, while also engaging in massacres all over Palestine. So rather than, for me, treating the British and Zionist colonization as separate projects, we should actually view them as complementary and working within an existing framework, even though differing at times on the speed or the emphasis of the implementation process, meaning that it is the British colonization of Palestine that opens the doors for the Zionists to have a foothold on Palestine within a colonial paradigm. They are very important. Herzl spoke of colonization. All of the major Zionist wise men spoke of colonization. Jabotinsky spoke of colonization. The Ben-Gurion spoke of colonization. So there was no doubt within the Zionist reference point that Palestine is to be a colonial project, replicating at the time the dominant political features of European colonization. If we think about the Paris Conference of 1884-85 and the scramble for Africa, Zionists are born, or the Zionist movement is born within the European colonial paradigm. This dispossession of the indigenous population, not recognizing their rights to their land, was the norm, and therefore Zionism is born within the womb of European colonization with that mindset and with that worldview. So Palestine's colonization actually begins in earnest toward the end of the World War One, not 1948. 1948 is a different is another stage of the colonization, but it begins in earnest in 1917 at the end of World War One. The Ottoman army withdrew its troops and surrendered Jerusalem to the British command on the 8th or 9th of December 1917. With a letter from the governor of Jerusalem at the time, surrendering this. This was the surrender by Hussein Bey al-Hussein, the deputy mayor of Jerusalem at the time, who surrendered the Jerusalem at the end of this 1917 and the British colonization. More importantly, in here, 2 days after the Ottoman surrender of Jerusalem, to safeguard it from destruction. So actually, the Ottoman did not want that bombardment to actually destroy Jerusalem. But 2 days after, General Edmund Allenby, the British general, entered the city on foot through the Jaffa Gate, while declaring on this historic occasion, this is very important, he says, the wars of the Crusades are now complete. So Allenby and the British framed their arrival into Palestine as a continuation or as a completing or bringing to an end the wars of the Crusades. Allenby reported statement was a powerful indicator that the British considered, at least rhetorically, their arrival in Palestine and entry into Jerusalem as a continuation of and bringing into successful conclusion the Crusades. In Allenby's statements, we are introduced to a critical epistemic in here that is connected to the Crusades of the 11th to the 14th century period. In European and Western thought, the Crusades continues to occupy a considerable space in the imaginary and the permanent resistance to reconcile the defeat and eventual loss of Palestine in 1187 to Salah ad-Din. So if we think that the British actually spoke of their campaign on Palestine in Crusaders' terms, Prime Minister of the UK at the time, David Lloyd George, described the capture of Jerusalem as a Christmas present for the British people, articulating that the conquest of Palestine, the colonial conquest at the time, is basically a Christmas gift, and made sure to direct Allenby to take the city before the holidays by the cabinet instruction to make it as a symbolic religious affirmation. Now, the Allenby statement and referencing the crusade was not isolated or unique, as illustrated by a number of British press and book publication from the period. For example, the Punch's main caption, which is a weekly at the time, on December 19th, 1917, declared, "The Last Crusade." That was the headline on the newspaper, showing Richard Coeur de Lion looking down toward Jerusalem and nodding contentedly, my dream comes true." So this again, how the British framed the arrival to Jerusalem. The British press was, which was initially instructed in a private and confidential memo dated November 15th, 1917, not to refer to the military operation against Turkey in any sense as a holy war, a modern crusade, or anything whatever to do with religious questions. Immediately after the war, moved quickly and in short period of time after the instruction to emphasize the centrality of religion in discussing the occupation of Jerusalem. Now, why I mention this is very important, because colonization often utilize religious epistemology, using a religious references. And Palestine today still occupies that central aspect of think of it in religious terms, especially among those within Eurocentric European thought, thinking of or using dispensationalist theology, referencing in here the Crusades, meaning that Jerusalem is taken after 672 years of Muslim rule, and is returning it to the fold of its rightful owners. In here, the Europeans, epistemologically, not the fact that they are actually the true owners or possessors. It's a colonial project. In a telegram wired from Palestine, the British Information Office mentioned two of the commanders who have played a great part in the South Palestine campaign as descendants from knights who fought in the Wars of the Crusade. This was actually emphasized in a memo. In addition, a few months after the conquest of Jerusalem, the Department of Information, the British Department of Information, released a 40-minute official film entitled, take this, The New Crusades, with the British forces on the Palestine front. So it actually posited and had a 40-minute what we call today documentary or embedded journalist reporting the new crusades. That's not my statement, that's the British statement defining what is actually their undertaking. This occurs just a matter of immediate few months after the occupation. Furthermore, in the period after World War I, a large number of published books and had the Crusades incorporated into it. Khaki Crusaders, that was a 1919 publication. Temporary Crusades, 1919 publication. The Modern Crusades, 1920. The Last Crusade, 1920. With Allenby's Crusaders, 1923. And The Romance of the Last Crusade, 1923. So all these books come describing this as a reference to the Crusades. Now, in here, the Crusades have a considerable impact on both the imagery of Europe, but also impacting the Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, and so on, with this death and destruction being visited on the population. Eitan Per-Yusuf correctly observes that the British government effort was consciously staged as an exercise in propaganda, shaped, filtered, and capitalized in order to enhance nations' morale. This observation, again, about using the Crusades as a frame. Why do I say that when we speak about Palestine as something colonial? If we reference and think of the Crusades as a campaign that begins in the 11th to 14th century, the British framed their engagement in Palestine in crusading terms as a way to actually cover over, to obfuscate the fact that it is a colonial project. And embedded in the British colonial project was the incubation of Zionism. So Zionism gets immediately implanted within the British infrastructure. During World War I, the British actually formed what is called the Jewish Legion that fought on the Eastern Front in Palestine. And once the war ended, the Jewish Legion was incorporated into the Mandate Authority. And the Mandate Authority needs to be understood. It's basically colonialism in modern parlance and modern language that was, in essence, to try to get the League of Nations to appear to be that it is honoring and recognizing the sovereignty and self-determination. But all indication is just a colonization by another term. So immediately the League of Nations incorporated the Balfour Declaration and began the process of transforming Palestine into a colonial state to be handed over at a later point to the Zionist movement. So from 1917, the mandate in 1922, from 1922 until literally the British are leaving in May 15th, 1948, that period is the period of incubation. The incubation of a Zionist project required to actually transform demographically by allowing and facilitating Zionist immigration to Palestine. Important note in here, Zionism begins almost 50 years before World War II and the Holocaust. meaning if we think about the first Zionist settlement in Palestine, it should be traced to 1876, and then more also in the early 1880s, beginning with the whole notion of settling and transforming Palestine. Herzl began his work on the Judenstaat, the Jewish state, and the World Zionist Organization First Conference in 1897. So it's much, much earlier. Many people, I think, wrongly assume or wrongly frame that Zionism or the establishment of Israel was a way to atone for the German and the European Holocaust that has been committed against the Jewish population. While it could be said that the World War II and the Holocaust accelerated the project, but the project of Zionism and dispossessing the Palestinians and transforming Palestine into the state of Israel that came to be in 1948, it's a project that actually begins much earlier, in again 1876 onward, even when one can actually look and speak about it to be much earlier, because Napoleon's campaign on Egypt in 1797-98, he actually also introduced the idea of calling on the Jewish populations, in particular in the East, to join him, with the idea of reconstituting or bringing the Jews back into Palestine. Again, that's the thread in European, Western European Christianity and Western European thought. It often engages in reconstituting the Jewish population in Palestine as a stepping stone for the second coming of Jesus. So it's really a utilitarian function in adopting and incubating Zionism. So between 1922 and 1948, it's a demographic transformation. In 1917, Palestine had less than close to 3% Jewish population. These were predominantly Palestinian Jews of long historical presence, but also the arrival of Zionist immigration and settlement beginning in 1876 onward. But from 1922, from the mandate until the creation and the emergence of the state in 1948, the British facilitated the demographic change by transforming or bringing the population percentages to 37%. Now, I know some of the Zionists complain that the Peel Commission and the white paper that was issued that limited immigration, and I think in here one could say that they're accurate in describing the sentiments of trying to limit, but that limitation was a direct outcome of Palestinians' opposition, and the fact that there were a large number of Palestinians that have been dispossessed, thrown out of their lands because they were sharecroppers, and as Zionists began to build settlements, and also the Zionist labor union prohibited the employment of Arab labor. So all of a sudden, these Palestinian farmers that were living on land and having sharecropping as a phenomena, all of a sudden they were thrown off the land, which was one of the main causes for the 1936 uprising, or the the Arab revolt at that time that lasted from 36 to 39. And I would say, if we want to speak about the Nakba itself, the Nakba unfolds in stages, and the 1936-39 is an important stage for the Nakba, because the 1935-36 dismantled Palestinian society, ends up in the death and killing of 5,000 of the Palestinians. It results in the exile of Palestinian leadership. It also, from the Zionist side, it begins the process of the village mapping and the village files that is used in 1948 to target and ethnically cleanse the villages that takes place. So the British project, colonial project, allowed and permitted the demographic change. It also incubated the military aspect. The Zionists were allowed at first to have the Jewish Legion that were part of the mandate infrastructure, allowed Zionist settlers and settlements from that period to have their own police force, import their own weapons and guns, and in essence becomes almost a state within a state relative to military power. Added to this dimension, the fact that the Zionists who came from Europe came from an advanced industrialized society. That's a fact that cannot be overemphasized, meaning that they came with the European industrialization, but also the legacy of having the tools and equipment to advance militarily in a short period of time, while the British denied that type of development, advancement, access to weaponry to the Palestinians in their own land. So the British were systematically engaged in the weakening of the Palestinian hold within the military guys, because they were subject to draconian colonial regulations to prevent them from actually arriving at a center of power. The third component, which is likewise very critical, is the economic empowerment, colonial economic empowerment that the British likewise facilitated. There's records where Europeans, British, would be the avenue to buy land and constitute economic projects. And these projects were, in essence, passed to or being a front for actually Zionist economic projects and Zionist purchases of land, sometimes from absentee and sometimes from others. So the Europeans, the British, the French, the German, later on also the Americans, always played this role of being intermediary, empowering Zionist colonization of Palestine above and over the Palestinians, while the same rights and the same type of economic development were denied to the Palestinians in this sense. So we have to know that colonization begins as a process of transformation from 1917, and then leading into the Nakba in 1948. So when we think about the manners and the ways that the Nakba unfolded, again, for me, it's the emphasis on the 1936-39, and then the Nakba occurs in 48. And I do recommend for people to read Ilan Pape's book on ethnic cleansing of Palestine, is or also Nur Masalha's book, the Nakba. These are two important books that deals with the Nakba and documenting the systematic way by which the ethnic cleansing, the transfer, again, from a colonial, I said that colonization does two things simultaneously, sometimes separate, sometimes actually in succession: genocide and transfer. So the 1948 Nakba, in a systematic way, based on the village files from the 1936-39, which was also developed by all these academics that are part of the Tel Aviv University, and many of these archives that are still held by academics, being complicit, co-participants in the bringing about of the Nakba. And this will become the systematic ethnic cleansing and committing multiple massacres, in at least 120 massacres that could be documented from the 1948, that results in the flight of the Palestinians, right? 2 days ago, the New York Times had this reference as the Palestinians left in 1948, which is again introducing some of the most discredited materials on the 1948, some of the most propagandist information that's put out, and again, the New York Times becoming another piece amplifying the statements that have been put out by Israel and by the Zionists in post the creation of the state, even though that researchers across including some of the Zionist researchers like Benny Morris, who wrote about the Palestinian refugee problem and documented massacres, and then end up actually justifying acts of genocide and ethnic cleansing by actually saying you can't make an omelet without cracking eggs. So basically describing the Nakba and the expulsion of the Palestinians, the massacres, compared to actually making an omelet. The omelet in this sense being, or the eggs that being cracked are the Palestinians, and as such justifying ethnic cleansing, justifying genocide, and justifying colonization in this sense. So the key in here for us take away as trying to conclude this segment is that Palestine is a colonial project. Palestine is to be recognized and thought of within a colonial paradigm. Colonization begins in 1917 by the British colonization first, and then shifting the, if you want to say, the colonial franchise to the Zionist throughout the mandate period, and leading to 1948. And as such, we have to approach it in a colonial examination rather than the constant attempt to think of it as a misunderstanding that could be resolved through dialogue and so on. So Palestine, it is something colonial. Again, I was referencing some of the material in here, and to emphasize that it's the key for us in approaching the question. I'll get into another session, hopefully in the future, and continue to build on this. So Palestine is something colonial. Colonial project begins with the British and continues with the Zionists in 1948 Nakba. And now we are seeing a continuation. The Nakba never stopped. The colonization is a process that is never ended until colonization itself brought to an end. So when you are watching and seeing what is taking place in Gaza today is a continuation of the Nakba, not disconnected from it. And the fact that the United States, Europe, and some of the Arab post-colonial regimes are all co-participants should not surprise us. They incubated this project. They saw it as part of a long history of the Crusades. They still see it as their right to determine the outcome, and they are cheerleading what they consider to be a successful project with incubated European American colonial discourses, hegemonic discourses in the contemporary period. So it's very important to say there is a straight line of continuity for the Nakba and the colonial legacy that we are witnessing in Palestine. So thank you for being with me today, and hopefully I'll come back with another segment to read sections of the book, comment on it, and continue to build on the theme of Palestine is something colonial. So good night, assalamu alaikum, and I'll see you again in the near future.